Hey, welcome to Let It Be. I'm Vanessa, and this is my little corner of music YouTube. Today I'm going to do a book review, another music related book. It's going to be The Story of the Bee Gees, Children of the World by Bob Stanley. It's a book that came out this year. I've always been interested in learning more about the Bee Gees overall, and listening to more of their music. I did know a few albums going into this, and of course, all the big hits. And I've just always what I've heard has piqued my interest enough to make me want to check them out further. So while I was listening to, or pardon me, while I was reading this book, I was listening to their entire discography as well. I'm not going to do a full ranking or anything because that is a lot more of an intensive dive. I'm just going to do some general impressions from what I heard from me listening to their albums and reading the book. Anyway, so first I'll start with the book review. I think this is a very well written and well balanced book. It tells their story, but it also gets into their music a satisfying amount. Because sometimes I find that biographies about artists focus a little too much on their personal lives and not as much on their music. And that I don't really like. I like to have a balance. I also don't want something super dry that just gets into only the music and nothing about who they were or what informed that process. So there is definitely an ideal balance when it comes to an artist biography. And I think that this author, Bob Stanley, he balances it all very well. So that is definitely a major positive for this book. The author says right from the beginning in his introduction that he is a big fan of the band. So that comes through. But he's also a realistic fan, which I appreciate. He's not afraid to criticize periods where he feels like it is appropriate to criticize. Like if an album is not that good, he will say that in the book. And I do appreciate having that balance. I don't like this whole, especially modern internet idea of a fan where you have to worship everything the artist puts out. If you call yourself a fan, like that whole stan culture, not a fan of that. So I like that this is a more balanced view. You really feel his appreciation and love for them overall. It comes through in the care he puts into his writing and telling their story, but he's also a realist, and that's what we need. So I think that that balance is captured very well in this book. And you also get a really good understanding of who they were as people, who Barry, Maurice, and Robin were as people and artists, and how that informed their art and what they were aiming for when they were creating their music and what they were trying to do. I don't think it delved too much into their personal life where it felt invasive. I think if anything, it was maybe a little more focused on the music than anything else, which is good. But it did still bring that context in about what was going on with their lives at the time. And there was a lot of stuff I didn't know, like that they briefly broke up for a year in in 1969, 1970, because Robin got fed up with Barry being in the spotlight. And I also didn't know in the beginning that they had a couple other members that were officially part of the band other than the brothers. So that was interesting. Like this brought into some context that I just did not know. Because honestly, despite them being such a big band over the years and so many hits and like especially like staying alive is ubiquitous, everybody knows that song. I don't really feel like I knew too much about them, so this was good to bring that into view so that I do know more about them now and who they were as individuals as well as a band. And it's easy to read. It's not too bogged down in details. They show, like I said before, reasonable restraint about talking about their personal life and in presenting a balanced picture. And it's really cool to get a glimpse into their early life and their early career, which was very enlightening. I did not know much about that at all. So it was interesting to go back to what it was like for them growing up, starting on the Isle of Man, then they moved to Manchester, and then they moved to Australia. Like the family moved around a ton, which is not something I knew about them. And I didn't know that both of their parents were musicians as well. Their father was touring he met their mother, who was a singer, she had to give up the career to have a family. And eventually so did their dad, because it wasn't a viable industry to be in and make money, so he had to do odd jobs. And they always struggled with money when they were growing up. And none of this is anything that I knew about them. So it brings just a whole perspective to their approach to their art and their humble beginnings, for sure. So that was pretty cool to get that bigger picture. Um, I do feel like the author always treats them as artists with more respect than they sometimes get in the media. I think it's not so much now, but obviously in the 80s, they were very disrespected after their big breakthrough, not breakthrough, but like the disco years in the late 70s and the backlash that they got later. The author always treats them with the respect that they sometimes felt like they didn't get, which they definitely didn't for certain periods. And that was nice and refreshing too, because sometimes even now you see people who are like, well, I know it's the Bee Gees, but it's good, you know. They you hear that sometimes, so it's nice to have just someone look at them from a perspective of being, because they were around for so long and they had so many hits and they were responsible for so many hits by other people, that obviously they were onto something. They knew what they were doing, so they deserve that respect anyway. So that is the book. I would give it a light 4 stars. It's, if I was rating out of 5. It's not my favorite book I've ever read that is a biography of an artist. I do think maybe it could have delved a little deeper into some aspects, but it was still an entertaining, enjoyable read. I definitely recommend it, especially if you're interested in them. I feel like I know more about them and know them as artists a little better. So that was really cool. Now on to the discography. So listening through, I did it chronologically, of course, and I did include their 2 Australian albums, or Australia only albums, from 1965 and 1966, when they were still basically kids. I wouldn't say that either of those albums are especially essential, but they were interesting to see where they started out and the roots of their art. Like, they were still, like I said, they were kids, so they were still learning, and you can hear that almost in real time when you're listening, especially their first album, because it was a collection of singles that they released previous to 1965 on this small label in Australia, plus a couple new songs. But it's very, there's quite a variance in quality and sounds, and it's just them getting to know themselves and their songwriting and everything. So yeah, it was cool to hear. Nothing that I ever need to hear again. And it's not on streaming, so you have to seek it out on YouTube. But it's worth checking out if you're interested, just to say you did and see where they started out. So anyway, from the big picture that I got from listening to their discography is that generally I am a fan more of them in the earlier part of their career, from 67 to 75-ish. After that, things get much rougher for me. I'm not necessarily the hugest fan of the what people call the disco era, although they really only have one album that you could really call disco, and that would be Children of the World. I'd even say Spirits Having Flown, while Tragedy opens the album and was a big single and a disco classic, I guess. The rest of the album's more 70s pop, but it is just so heavy in Barry's falsetto, and I realized very quickly that there is a ceiling for me on that, and it's not the highest ceiling in the world, and it's certainly not an album's worth of a ceiling. So that was a bit rough. I don't hate it on its own, but I need more balance. Like, I need other things going on. So that was interesting, because I did expect to like those 2 albums, Children of the World and Spirits Having Flown, a little bit better than I did. So I guess that's why we do this. That's why we go in and we listen to everything and see how we feel. Obviously the big hits of that period overall are classics for a reason, and I'm not taking that away from them, but I have to say that I don't necessarily need to hear the albums ever again. And after that, things get even worse for me overall, with one exception. The album that I liked the best in the latter part of their career would be Living Eyes from 1981, which did nothing at the time because there was huge backlash against them. They never apparently liked the album, and it caused them to go into retirement, basically, or partially, for their own albums for like 6 years after that. But I actually liked it. I thought it was a nice balance and a refreshing album after that really popular period in the late 70s. So what do you know? But after that, through the 80s, the 90s, 2001 for their last album, did not like any of those albums really at all. I have to say that they all leaned into production styles of the time that they were released. 1986, 89, 93, 91, 2001 are all like, they leaned into, I think, the aspects of those time periods that I just do not like. And so it was rough listening to those. But I will say one thing, even with that sort of negative view of them and the fact that I didn't really enjoy them, I will say that they always drew from styles of the time and the music that they personally appreciated, brought it into their own art, and made it their own. And even in those periods that I don't like what they're doing, I can appreciate what they're doing and respect the craft that went into it. It just was not something that I enjoyed listening to. So with that out of the way, the negative part, I do really quite like the earlier part of their career. And I knew that anyway. I already knew To Whom It May Concern. I own it. I've owned it for a while. And I would also say that that is my favorite Bee Gees album of all their albums. And close behind it is Odessa, which is a classic one that a lot of people point to. There's a lot of great songs on that one. Very ambitious, maybe a little too ambitious. There's parts of it I probably would cut out, which prevents it from being like an all-time classic necessarily for me, but it's still very good. And like I said, there's some great songs on it. Bee Gees First, they're basically their big introduction to the world, is a really good album, and one that is well regarded for a reason as well. And Idea and Trafalgar would round out my top 5. I would say those were my favorite albums by them. I just think that those were the best encapsulations of what they were doing and at the time, and the best songs overall as sets. And in between, they still had some good albums at the time that maybe were not my favorites, but I like Main Course, which is a very transitionary album in 1975 between what they were doing before and what they ended up doing in the later 70s and their huge hit making period. And it was the beginning of some more hits for them after a bit of a dry period in the earlier 70s. So, or the earlier part of the mid 70s, I guess, really 73, 74. So yeah, that's a cool album. And really, actually, Life in a Tin Can, which is not a very beloved album at all, I actually quite like. I like their take on more of a country sound. And I think they were pretty successful in bringing that sound and making it their own. I don't think anybody else could make that genre sound like they did. So that was kind of a cool album, despite the fact that people seem to hate it. I think it's pretty good. I already knew it before this, but even going back to it, I liked it pretty well. So even the less successful albums of that time period, I still tend to like better than what came later. So even Horizontal, which came after the Bee Gees First only by a few months, I think, is still really good. It's just less, it just stands out less. And 2 Years On is the album that they released after their brief breakup for a while, or after Robin left for a while, I guess you could say. And it was rushed, and it does sound like it was rushed, but they were still at the height of their powers at that point, so it's still good. And then there is Mr. Natural, which falls in between Life in a Tin Can and Main Course. Another one that would have been really a low point for them at that time, and a very transitionary album, even more so than Main Course. And that one's a little more patchy. It's got some really good songs on it that I like at the beginning, and then it's a variation in quality, and that hurts it a bit, but I still think it's good. So anyway, I came out of this not necessarily a huge fan in the end, but I would say that I'm a fan of the earlier period, which I already sort of knew, but that confirmed it. And it also confirmed that I don't really need to hear anything from the latter part of their career really ever again, other than maybe a few songs. And that's the handy thing is I already own a pretty good greatest hits compilation, which covers some of their earliest big hits and all the big hits from that latter period, the ones that I would want to hear again, of course, like Nights on Broadway, How Deep Is Your Love, More Than a Woman, Night Fever, Tragedy. Those are all good songs. I just don't necessarily need some of the albums that they came from. And it does have this also has some of their really big early singles like New York, Mining Disaster 1941, To Love Somebody, Massachusetts, Words. So it's a good career capsule for me. And if I want some of the earlier albums, those I would pick up, the ones I like the best, but otherwise don't need to collect too much from them. But I'm still glad I did this. Still glad I read this book. It was a good book. And still glad that I explored their discography further because I've been wanting to for a long time. And even if you don't always come out of these dives being like the biggest fan of a band or anything, you still learn something about your feelings about the band. And it's always valuable in the end, even if there's stuff that you absolutely do not enjoy. That's okay. So, what are your thoughts on the Bee Gees? Are you an earlier Bee Gees fan? Do you like everything? I'd love to know. I feel like they're a band where there's a lot of different periods that you can react to and love, or stuff that you could end up hating, and that happens too. So, I'm just interested to see what people think of them and what people's favorite albums are, favorite songs. So, yeah, till next time. Bye.